So today we're going to talk about something that this is probably going to be one of my shorter videos because I don't have too much to share about it. We're going to talk about the economics of Primus. Now, back in the day, back when things were just getting started civilization-wise, most people would trade in flat barter system. Obviously, most economies start with a barter system. After time, the show, who were the first of the kingdoms of the non Daracost races, the show decided to start implementing something to facilitate long-term trade. Now, I want to discuss this a bit because this is actually what happened in real life too, and not everyone is fully aware of why currency became a thing. So I just want to talk about it. Forgive me for those of you who know what I'm about to say. The reason currency became a thing was because if you're trading with someone hundreds of miles away, physically carrying your goods there suddenly becomes a hassle, doesn't it? Now, at some point, someone can carry those goods, but if you are a carpenter and you've made all this great woodcraft, but you don't want to carry all this great woodcraft all the way over here, you sell it to someone, gain currency, which is much, much easier to carry than the actual product. Then you travel 100 miles over there to your destination and use the currency to buy whatever you want. Now, the catch is that currency has to have backing. I've talked extensively about the idea of backing currency in many of my videos, but the overall premise is always really the same. Something has to be there to show that that currency has worth, and it's usually something intangible rather than something tangible. People famously point to gold as being something that actually has value, but that's actually a bit of a fallacy because gold itself is only valuable because it has backing. Gold itself is not the backing. Make sense? There has to be something that says it is valuable. Now, in real life, that's usually things that are more rare or prettier or are associated with something else culturally or societally, with gold being an excellent example, but also, of course, salt, the time when silk was dominating the trade lines, et cetera, et cetera. There's several examples of this, of things that have dominated economies. Oil is a good example right now in real life. Here in Dareth, in order to get the economy going, they needed to have some kind of backing to make currency happen. And the show, like I said, the show were the first kingdom. Before anyone else had actually organized into something that could be called a nation, the show were doing it. They're like, all right, look. We have people all the way over there who want to trade with these people all the way over here. And they have goods and we have goods. And remember, back in the day, travel was usually on foot. Now, they had the knowledge of things like the wheel. Remember, these are people who had basically just started mastering stone carving and ironworking. So it's not like they didn't have caravans and whatnot. But still, a wagon trip across, Europe, for example, is going to take a while. In some cases, though, it was deemed worth it. And the show wanted to encourage it. Why? Well, because the Burun is... Yeah, the Burun, as I've talked about before, have a little bit of that natural superiority thing that the Scions did. But they were genuinely a fairly wise race. They were a race whose entire mindset was look towards the long term, not the short term. And they decided if they could try and push continent-wide trade, that would encourage communication, trading of ideas, trading of cultures, understanding of different people. And basically, they were trying to build a fabric, weave, if you will, a net amongst all of the different races across the continent in order to bind them together. Maybe not necessarily in one unified power, but at least promoting peace and cooperation and understanding. And it worked brilliantly. The show at a loss, the show magnates, the Burun leaders, would take of their own personal repositories of treasure and wealth and would basically burn that into making this new currency. And that's how they backed it initially. This is backed by insert Burun magnate here. If you want to question his honor or her honor, if you want to question their ability to support and supply in the wake of this, well, you're going to have to bring it up with them. And nobody wanted to do that. Remember, the Burun were the only people who were leaders at this point in time. Everything else was tribal at best. Even the recently formed clans were basically done as a way to help build families because no one knew whose families was what. Oh, shoot, I meant to talk about it in the Scion video. It is worth noting, I'll talk about it here because this is helpful to the whole economics thing. I already talked about this, but when the Scions went away, basically everyone's memory was wiped. Now this is logical. The Scions were so constantly controlling everyone that when that presence was abruptly, violently lifted, Well, I mean, if you are in the middle of processing a file and all of a sudden, you rip the power cord out of your computer, it's not going to take that well, is it? So everyone's memory, and I mean everyone with very few exceptions, the Olthoi being a big one, got wiped. So people didn't know who each other were. Can you imagine that for a moment? You don't know who your family is. Literally. You don't know who your wife or children or parents are. You don't even know who you are. It was a bit of a chaotic time. Now, the Derikos did help smooth that over, especially initially, and so did the Burun, because again, it was still in their nature, even without memory, to act in a more long-term perspective. Like, okay, hang on, hang on. This is why the clans were formed to begin with. We need to make families, and we don't know how to do that. So, okay, well, your fur is kind of lighter than mine, but his fur is your color. So you two be over there, I'll be over here. Point being, without any previous establishment, this form of economics enabled people to be able to say, oh, well, let's coordinate and interact. And again, the Burun were the only leaders that rose out of this situation. The Derikost, after their initial thing, just kind of went way into the sideway. It wouldn't show up again for about 2 centuries. So this whole time, the Burun were pretty much the only ones running anything. And the show established a rather strict caste system, not as a sense of superiority or because screw you or any of the other reasons you might assume. It was because they needed people who would be workers. They needed people who would be fighters. They needed people who would be leaders. And so they just kind of decided, because they had no other means of determining anything, they'd do it along species lines. Burun became the leaders, Sclavi became the fighters, Morsmen became the workers. And over time, that would mutate and evolve, as societies always do. But you're like, well, what does that have to do with the economy? Well, the Burun first started establishing, like I said, a form of currency. They would actually smelt their metals into something more usable. Now I know what you're thinking. So this is where gold came from. No, they used tin. See, here's the thing. In Primus, different materials, the way this works, and I know this is related to weaving, but this is integrally tied in to economics. The more resistant... Okay, so there's 2 types of interaction with magic when it comes to materials in Primus, okay? First is its ability to conduct, and the second is its ability to withhold, to maintain, okay? So things that are highly conductive to magic are extremely useful in many different reasons, right? Something that is very, very non-conductive to magic just isn't going to be nearly as useful to the people in the society as a whole. Even in the modern era, 350 years later, materials and items, and this is not just minerals, but with regards to different types of trees or different types of rock or different types of dirt, different everything, plastic, that kind of a thing. All of that has a different conductivity to magic. I've mentioned before that the Scions would use Imperial as a form of circuitry almost, because it would conduct magic almost perfectly, almost a near perfect resonance to magic. So if you wove something over here and wove something over here, you can connect the two with Imperial lines and it would work just fine. Now, the thing is, that is different from its resistance level, its ability to withhold. Imperial is one of the hardest things to weave directly. It may conduct magic, but that's the point. You try to weave something into Imperial and it just weaves right back out. Thus, this is one of the reasons why Imperial golems are one of the strongest types of golems that exist. Why so many gemstones are so very, very valuable, like diamond, for example, because they are extremely resistant to weaving, and therefore the amount of power it takes to weave them is magnitudes greater. In other words, if you weave a light bulb out of a chunk of tin, or if you weave a light bulb out of diamond, the diamond light bulb is going to be stronger, better, last longer. It basically in every way is going to be superior to the tin one, even if it was the same weaver who crafted both. Make sense? Now, that is obvious. That has its own connotations for everything, but the conductivity is what I want to talk about right now. Things that can naturally conduct magic were very, very useful, especially in the older age, before they started doing things like weaving more complicated devices. Before things like, actually what I keep calling circuitry, before woven circuitry became a thing, being able to weave something that just has a natural flow to magic was very useful, and thus items that were naturally conductive were very valuable, like tin. Tin is actually very naturally conductive to magic, along with a few other more base metals like aluminum, for example. So tin was something that was considered very, very valuable. The mere fact that they would give away tin like this was considered unheard of. That they would be willing to say, yeah, we will give you this tin in exchange for this. And it fulfilled the other critical component of currency that, in my frank opinion, real life has failed on. That the currency itself is useful. Ugh. I'd like to say I did this on purpose, but I didn't. I've just had a dollar bill lying around here for weeks. See this? Okay, this has a purpose. This is one unit of currency I could go and purchase with. So it does have use. However, let's assume I'm on Pluto for a moment. I know, bear with me. What is this thing's use? At best, this is something I could use maybe to help with making a fire or something like that. The same as any other piece of paper. And I know it's not actually paper, it's a form of cloth. Point being, this is not useful in and of itself. Tin, for these people, was useful. If you decided to, if you were someone in another state or another country or another city, and you were willing to trade your livelihood for tin, you might be doing it because you wanted that tin, to use it, not just to use as a medium of trade. This was the foundation of the very first currency in Primus. Now, this evolved over the years until it got to the point where the show had decided they didn't have enough tin to actually constantly be flowing throughout the world. Too many times it would be lost. Like, for example, let's say you're a caravan wandering along the road and you bust a wheel and you fall into a canyon. People may never find that caravan, the people who fell there or the goods they were carrying. Now, I know that's morbid, but the Baroon looked at this and said, well, that means that tin has been removed from the market. The flow of economy has just been reduced. And this was happening semi-frequently, especially in the older days, because it was much more dangerous to live in the older days. There were still harpies attacking semi-regularly. And the centaurs, oh, let's not talk about the centaurs. Banditry became a thing because of tin. Now, it is worth noting that banditry was actually worse back then than it is now. Back then, what they called bandits would nowadays be branded as pirates. Brief aside, for those of you who don't know what I mean by that, a bandit in the modern era is someone who is a thief, right? And they're willing to take what you have by force, but they are not willing to kill you, and they're not willing to step over the line. They're not going to rape you, they're not going to violate you, they're not going to eat you, all the other horrible, disgusting, depraved things you can do to a person. They won't do that. They won't do that because doing so would get them branded a pirate and get them hunted down by every race on the entire country, continent even. Piracy is considered absolutely horrible in the modern age, and there are entire sections of the Daracost Accords written specifically to combat piracy, and the Daracost have helped to try and stamp out piracy. So back then, some of the more horrible things would happen, mostly killing. There's actually no rape in my setting, because it's my setting, and I can make that true. Wow, this is really dark rain, isn't it? But, they would actually be willing to kill people in order to take their tin or their food or whatever it is they actually wanted from them. Banditry on the roads was a very real, very serious problem. Yep, that's what I thought. That's blood. So tin was getting removed from the market. And that was a problem because as much as they wanted to back the currency, tin was useful. They needed to use that tin. Sometimes tin was being removed from the market because it was being utilized. It would become part of an item or part of a woven artifact or whatever that would then be in use, thereby removing currency from the market. Now that may sound normal, but keep in mind, tin mines were few and far between. Even in the modern era, finding an actual reliable source of tin is a rarity. And so the Baroon said, for a while, we could just keep mining new tin. All we have to do is control how much we're entering into the market, and then try to match it to how much is leaving the market. Circulation, in other words. However, they said that will only last as long as we have new sources of tin, because some tin is simply leaving the market without a way to re-enter it into the market. We need something else. We need something disposable. This is when the second layer of backing came in. They started saying, okay. And at this point in time, it wasn't just tin, by the way. Coins, and it wasn't actually coins. It was these metal, like, rectangles you'd carry around of tin. You know, slabs is what they call them. Except, you know, they're like this big. But, and, you know, jangle like crazy. And so, aluminum coins had become a thing. What else had become a thing by this point? I got to think about that for a moment, actually. I can literally picture several emitters. Like, oh my gosh, I can't think of the metals off the top of my head. There are several different metals and stone as well, and gemstones, quite a few gemstones, that basically became currency because of their natural conductivity to magic. I'm sorry, I can't think of the list right off the top of my head. Forgive me, it's not relevant. Point being, the currency had expanded past just tin, but again, all of these things were actually valuable and useful resources that were being burnt. So they started saying, why don't we print paper? Now, I know, that's the duh thing, right? And I mentioned earlier the thing about the dollar bill and how it's individually useless, but that was actually their deliberate intent. They wanted something that was useless, so if it was taken out of the market, they could just make new. They actually established a system where they would weave each one of these writs. Yes, these are where writs actually came from, by the way. In time, writs would become much more valuable. But each writ had a simple number denomination on it. Very, very simple. Very binary, 10-based system. 1, 10, 100, 1,000, million. Okay? Very simple. And each one would actually be woven with a very small amount of magic, but something that would be very deliberately done to track them. And once a year, they had people whose only job was to, and I shouldn't say track, but basically be able to send out like a ping on a very specific magical frequency. And every year they had people whose entire jobs, Moorsmen specifically, whose entire jobs was taking an account of how much paper money was still left in the economy. And inevitably it would go down because of bandits, because sometimes the paper would get torn, because sometimes, you know, it would get lost, or you'd leave it on in the bathtub or something like that, you know. So paper currency was still being destroyed, but it didn't matter. So they would try to keep track of how much was destroyed, and they would recreate new paper as a result of that. Now, as a result of this type of economy, there was no such thing as inflation or deflation. The economy stayed almost completely stasis with itself, because every piece of paper literally meant this is worth this much of the previous type of currency. You know, one was worth 1 pound, I believe it was. Or no, not, that's way too much. 1 ounce of tin, for example. And the people were expected to back that. If you walked up to someone of wealth or significance, usually someone in authority, by this time some of the other governments had started coming up, townships and whatnot, although the show were the only thing that were still a full kingdom. But if you walked up to a king and said, or a kingdom and said, you know, I have these notes, I request this much tin, or this much peridot, or this much amethyst, they would have to say okay. Because if they didn't back it, the paper currency would fall apart and they'd be back to the problems they had before. Now, they also had a few other problems that some people didn't really want to use the paper currency, for some of the same reasons that people don't want to use it in real life. And there was a bit of a period of transition there. It is still going. My goodness, it's just really, really dark. There was a bit of a period of transition there, where people were still getting used to it and still resisting it, still trying to use the previous coin, gemstone, or rock forms of currency. And usually locally, you know, within a town or whatever, the actual currency would be that stuff, and then the more long-term stuff would be actual notes and pieces of paper and whatnot. It is worth noting that this was kind of a form of social evolution, though, because the way it used to be was in the town, you would just barter for what you want, and then you'd use the currency to trade across different towns. Now you'd use the currency to trade in town and use the paper currency to trade to other towns, and this would evolve again in our next step. The next thing that happened was the nations started to had expanded and become sufficiently prosperous as to, for the first time, this is about 200 years after year zero, about the year 200. It's actually the year, no, that's a lie. It's about the year 240-ish, I want to say, is when the species had finally expanded to the point of really being in conflict with each other. Not over ideologies or other reasons, literally over resources, over land. You know, the most basic form of conflict that could be considered to exist. I want this, and so do you. This is pretty much when the Daracost Accords became a thing. You know, there were some skirmishes and some infighting. The Daracost stepped in and said no. The Illuvian Kingdom was founded. You know, the several aspects of modern society were established. But one of the most important aspects was a complete overhaul of the economy. See, the problem was, just prior to this, by a few years, there was an extremely ambitious Burun whose name has been lost to history, and it doesn't matter anyways. But this Burun, some people disagree with whether it was female or male, decided that they wanted to expand their power base to the point where they could make a serious grab at becoming emperor. And then once they had the reins of the emperorship, and the emperor being the one in charge of the military, they could actually expand militarily. No more of this, you know, Sclavian Moorsmen having to live alongside Lugians and Banderlings. We would just take their land. And if they're nice, they could live on our land. We would reap the benefits. He was extremely ambitious, extremely charismatic, and very smart. So what he did was he did the logical thing that, that kind of follows in show culture mandates. In other words, if you are perceived as blah, then you are received as blah. If you don't understand what I mean by that, let's say you're very, very weak. It doesn't matter how, militarily, economically, physically, magically, it doesn't matter. Let's say you're weak. Let's say, however, that you have arranged it because of your manipulations or your standing or your outright lies or whatever, that everyone around you, your neighbors and your fellows, they think of you as strong. Even if they know you're weak, the way the show culture works is they will now treat you as if you are strong. So what he did was, over the course of several years, slowly built up a bank of this paper currency. Large quantities of it. He was freely giving out actual valuable resources in exchange for the currency, pulling it out of the system, but not really, because it was still part of the system, and they'd do the yearly tabulation, and the currency would still show up, because it's still intact. This, if you know anything about an economy, know this. An economy is a fluid thing. The way an economy works, it is constantly in motion. That is literally what an economy is, the flow of goods, currency, etc. Okay? And I love using this analogy to explain it. Let's say you've got a car engine running, and you reach out and grab one of the pistons and just prevent it from moving. What do you think that does to the rest of the engine? So the economy, as you might imagine, started to destabilize horribly as this hoarding was happening. And it got to the point that the paper currency started to become more and more rare, more and more valuable, which was kind of an odd thing because you'd think it wouldn't work that way, but its rarity alone made it more valuable. It was a form of artificial inflation. Naturally, since he had all that currency, it took very little time for him to go ahead and, when the moment was right, before a survey was going to be done, he went ahead and made his big move and decided to go ahead and bribe off several other nobles and put himself in a position where he seemed like he was very financially affluent and very politically powerful very suddenly. Because of show culture, whether he was or not didn't matter. He had just bribed all these people. They now had to say, yes, we serve you, which means everyone sees all these people serving him, or bowing to his will, or adhering to his ideas in the council chambers or whatever. So he went from being a mere server. I forget his actual rank. I actually decided this at one point. But basically he was below a count. A count being a regional leader. Excuse me. The equivalent of a governor over in Navarre. And I mention that because I know you guys have seen more of Navarre than anywhere else. So he went from being below a count to the emperor. He actually did ascend all the way up to the throne in very short period of time. The problem was the damage to the economy was rather severe. And it was pretty much the first problem he faced. And the way he faced that was by pushing the military to go conquer the other lands, to try and bypass the issues, to try and take people's attention away from the economic strife that was hitting the entire continent. This is pretty much when the Derichos stepped in and said, "Ugh." The Derichos believed, the Derichos, as I've mentioned, are kind of the opposite in mindset of the Burun. It's just like the Scions were. If we can solve the now, then screw the later. They would, like I said the other time, they will gladly, gleefully burn a house down to get rid of the insects within it. So they could have actually resolved and fixed the economy, and it could have kept flowing the way it did. And if they had, things might be better, economically speaking, than they are now. But they didn't. They said, nope, wiped the board clean, took all of those writs, and I do mean all of them, gathered them all together, and basically burned them, and said, from now on, writs are going to be the highest form of currency. You know, if you have a writ, it is worth tremendous wealth. I have to actually pull up my own chart on exactly how valuable this is, because it actually underwent a change as I had to fix my own economy from an out-of-character perspective. But while I'm pulling that up, that was the first thing they did. The second thing they did was they took 3 metals that were worthless. 3 metals that maybe look a little shiny, but otherwise have no actual purpose or significance or relevance, and they are not magically conductive, and they do not hold a magical charge worth a damn. These 3 metals are gold, silver, and copper. Now, in fairness, I probably could have made these anything, but one thing I've always said as a GM is I like to make it nice and simple for people, so I wanted to make sure that people knew that, gold was still the common denominator of currency, so that you don't have to think about it. Most settings use gold. It's easier that way, even if it doesn't make sense from an in-lore perspective. Looks like I don't actually know where that is. Huh. Okay, that's terrible. Well, regardless, where would I have written that down? I guess it doesn't matter. Point being, where's the screen? Point being, writs were established as the absolute valuable thing, and gold would be the highest. And so I know it goes like this: a copper is the equivalent of $1 US. I do this specifically for my players so they can easily understand the value of things. A copper is $1, a silver is $10, a gold is $100. Again, 1, 10, 100. Very simple. And again, the reason they use these specific metals is because they are basically worthless. They are absolutely garbage metals that no one puts a large amount of effort or time into procuring, because other than looking shiny, they have no purpose. Up until now, gold, copper, and silver have been purely decorative. Purely decorative. They cannot hold a charge for a damn. They are very non-conductive to weaving. Yeah, they're basically worthless. They're pretty. They're shiny. That's it. So these 3, so hardly anyone was mining these. So what the Derichos did was they themselves minted a set number of gold, silver, and copper coins. Each one of them was actually emblazoned with the Derichos symbol, as kind of a quiet reminder of the fact that the adults came down to fix your little problems. If you... Excuse me, if you are a person in Dareth right now, you were to pull out a coin from your coin purse, it will still have that Derichos emblem on it, because no one has ever minted any new coins. I hope you understand how much of an issue that could be. No coins, no new coins have entered the system. Some coins have, of course, left the system. However, not as many as it used to happen. Coins are more resilient than the paper, and each coin was woven, in addition to being, emblazoned with the Derichos staff, to be rather resilient. So, unless a chest of coins was literally tossed into the ocean, most of their currency, well over 98% of that currency, is still in circulation now. This was their solution to combat inflation or deflation, to keep the flow of economy running. And as I mentioned, this is much more recent than the older days, so the problems of bandits have gone down considerably, especially since the Derichos established that whole anti-piracy thing. And they established a new term called bandits, and the whole purpose of calling someone a bandit is saying, you can steal something if you want, but you can't, here's what you cannot do. As long as you don't step over that line, we'll be more tolerant of you than we otherwise would. Part of the Daracost Accords was basically allowing people to be thieves, as long as they weren't going to be worse than thieves, in order to try and curb the crime that was causing. And it did work for the most part, although there are, of course, still pirate groups out there, like the Reds, which the party has encountered several times. So these coins have been in circulation ever since. Same exact coins, same copper, silver, and gold coins. More recently, much more recently, within the last about 40 years or so, platinum coins have entered circulation. Now, these also have the Daracost stamp on them, but they are new. I don't mind telling you this because I have no idea how this would ever come up to the players. Basically, it got to the point where, because there was no inflation or deflation, and yet certain things were being considered so valuable, and people don't really want to be using writs all that often since there was a finite number of writs as well, and nobody was printing new of those. They wanted a new form of currency to try and help deal with things like buying a ship, for example, which was this incredible investment. And you don't want to literally be carrying chests, plural, of gold coins in order to pay for a new Magitech ship or an airship or whatever. So a certain faction of the Daracost decided to go ahead and invent platinum coins. Now, this is a bit of a weird one because platinum is magically conductive and is very, very powerful when it comes to weaving. It's not as high up as Imperial, but it's basically one step below Imperial. It is very, very powerful if you are able to weave it properly. I mention this because the only reason I put that out there is for the detectives out there to put together what I am already about to tell you. The idea that whoever did the first system is clearly not the people who made the platinum coins, because the thought and effort that went into the first system is completely absent in the platinum coins. One final note. This is a bit of foreshadowing. I'd like to give away little bits of foreshadowing in these things, just to help keep the audience engaged, and in the hopes that the players will watch these. There are more gold coins in circulation now than there were when the Daracost first forged them. That's all I'm going to say about that. But it is a plot point. It's actually an important plot point, and it helps to explain certain things. With that, I hope you will understand a little bit more about how the economy of this world functions, and otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and start working my next video. See you next time, guys.